Well, welcome everyone today on behalf of the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects and WoodSolutions to this webinar series on wood specification and use in external applications. In the spirit of reconciliation, Forest and Wood Products Australia and AILA acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and we acknowledge their connection to the land and their custodianship of country and forests. We pay our respects to elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Morning everyone, my name's Alastair Woodard. I'm part of the WoodSolutions technical team, and I'm here to facilitate this webinar series over the next 5 weeks. I'll come back and chat about this shortly, but looking forward to having you on board as we run through this webinar series. Just in terms of a little bit of housekeeping, in terms of interacting with today's webinar, if you like to chat amongst yourselves, use the chat function down the bottom of the Zoom screen. Just make sure you've clicked all panelists and attendees. We won't be monitoring the chat. That's more if you guys want to chat with one another. But we're definitely interested in getting your questions because we'll be having a Q&A session at the end of this, the last 10 minutes. So we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A as the presentation is being presented. People like certain questions, they can click on that and that'll prioritise them to the top. But we'll certainly get through as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar today. Also, there is informal CPD points for participation. You'll get a certificate of completion within a week of attending this webinar. If you don't see that, just check your junk mail. Sometimes it can end up in your junk mail folder. But please store those certificates in a safe place, as really we can't reissue them once they've been sent out by the WoodSolutions staff. And if you've got any specific questions around CPD, obviously ask your own industry association around those. Just briefly, a little bit about WoodSolutions and who we are. WoodSolutions is an industry initiative that's resourced through our Forest and Wood Products Australia. It's really there for building professionals. We want to inspire you to use wood products. And if you want to do so, we want to provide you with the right information and resources to ensure you use them correctly. So WoodSolutions has a range of activities such as the events we're doing today with our webinars and a seminar series. We do in-house technical tutorials, sponsor the major associations, and we also produce a lot of technical information. So pretty much all of the information you need to access from WoodSolutions is through our WoodSolutions website. And certainly if you haven't sort of been there, I'd encourage you to do so, woodsolutions.com.au. As I mentioned, technical work is something we spend a lot of time doing. If we get questions that come up on specific topics, we'll generally produce a specific technical guide on that. And we have 53 of these guides currently available in PDF form. They're all totally freely available. You just need to access the site, go to the resources section to get a handle on those. There's a number of these specifically that we'll be chatting about over the next 5 weeks, particularly number 4, which is building with timber and bushfire prone areas. Technical Design Guide 5, Timber Service Life Durability, number 13, which looks at finishing timber externally, and number 21 that looks at domestic timber deck design. So I encourage you to download those if you'd like access to them. Look, all our webinars also are recorded, so if you want to go back to listen to this one, either type in webinars in the search function or go to the resources tab and you'll see the webinar and podcast link. A whole range of fantastic information available there. We've done almost 80 webinars over the past couple of years with COVID, so some really interesting topics that have been covered. And this webinar, these webinar series will be sort of uploaded again over the next few weeks as they're delivered. WoodSolutions undertakes a range of events, and you can look at those again through our website under the events tab. There's links there to our AILA series that we're running at the moment. So if you haven't registered for some of the upcoming ones, you can do so from that point. And we also continue to run a regular monthly webinar going forward, so that might be of interest. But anyway, brings us to our webinar series today, which is all about the external use of wood. And again, as landscape architects, you're using lots of wood, whether that's in the vegetation and trees that you specify, or in the range of different types of wood products that we use externally. Obviously, cladding is a huge sort of market for the timber sector, some beautiful natural products that are used externally, interesting products from interesting profiles, including radially cut boards, as you see there. But wood cladding just mixes perfectly with the landscape design, that biophilic feel you get with the timber and the cladding of the building and the products that are used within the garden. Obviously, decking is another area that landscape architects specify quite regularly, again, mixing those beautiful sort of wood products with the natural vegetation. Screens, the last 10 years, we've seen really take off in the market, both if we're wanting to sort of hide certain areas, but also in use of opening screens, as we see here, to feature with ventilation or for covering of windows. Obviously, boardwalks, decks and marinas has always been a major opportunity for durable hardwood products. So we continually sort of see timber used in those applications. More and more so we're seeing in things like sort of public use buildings such as shelters, the use of timber, or obviously timber's used quite widely in different external furniture applications. Some really interesting architectural forms out there at the moment using timber products. It's really exciting to see the innovation that comes in this group. And obviously there's our normal landscaping products that we use, sleepers, fences, those type of products. And also obviously in that landscaping application, the different types of trees that landscape architects regularly specify. But I guess all of those things have one thing in common, and that is that they all come from wood. And it is an amazing material, natural, renewable, recyclable, sustainable, and greenhouse positive. I mean, it is amazing when you think about it that wood does grow from the air. So in effect, those trees take that CO2 in the atmosphere and they're using the process of photosynthesis, break that down, release the oxygen that we breathe and store that carbon in the woody trunk of the tree. It really is an amazing material as we go forward into a sort of low carbon future. But it is also biodegradable, so it does break down, and that's a positive thing. But it's also something we need to understand and design for when we're using timber used externally. So that's really the sort of aim of, I suppose, our series over the next 5 weeks. We want to give you all the information we can about how to specify timber properly, and to set things, to set the scene and get things up and running today. Our first presentation will look at our different forests and the different wood products available and the collective benefit that they provide globally as we strive for that sort of zero carbon future. And we're very fortunate to have present today Dr. Fabiano Ximenes, who's the Senior Research Scientist with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, and who's a world-renowned expert on wood and carbon. And I'll introduce Fabiano with his bio shortly. But Fabiano is going to discuss today both plantations and native forestry, wood and the carbon cycle, and how this can assist with climate change mitigation, the carbon impact of bushfires, and the carbon storage benefits of wood products, and what happens with this carbon at end of life. Next week on the 5th of April, I'm really excited that we're going to have a special webinar featuring some of your AILA members running their case studies. And we've got 2 great presenters here, Jerry de Grice, a director at Inspiring Place, who's going to talk about the firm's unique blend of skills and their philosophy behind the selection of timber within the projects they use. And he'll particularly talk about some of their key projects, including the lily pads, which was one of the award-winning projects that's part of the Royal Botanic Gardens. Also, Luke Smith, who's a senior architect and discipline lead for New South Wales and ACT at Arup, will then talk about Arup's philosophy to the use of timber. So a much bigger firm here, obviously, and how that's embedded within their approach to sustainable projects. And Luke will present about the award-winning Terrigal Boardwalk and Rockpool project, along with some of their other timber-rich projects. On the 12th of April, a really important presentation around timber durability and specification. This is obviously one of the key things when we use timber externally, and we're really fortunate to have one of the world's leading experts, Professor Jeff Morrell, present at that webinar. Jeff is the director of our National Centre for Timber Design and Durability and Design Life up in Queensland. And Jeff will talk about all the important aspects around durability, timber structure, natural durability, weathering and fungal and insect attack, mold and tannin leaching. So a really important webinar to listen into. Also, timber preservation and external finishing is obviously key. Not all of our timber has a natural durability, and we do need to preservatively treat it. And again, we've got 2 experts in these areas as well. Jack Norton will talk about timber preservation, look at all the different timber hazard treatment levels, the different preservation products available, and the key points around design, specification and maintenance. And keeping the original wood look is often very important to clients. And so Gareth Connell from Cabot's will give us the good oil, pardon the pun, with this External Timber Coatings 101 presentation, which overviews all the different timber finishing systems that are available for external wood products and the best finishing products to specify the different applications and how we need to maintain those for optimal performance. Then on the 26th of April, we want to look at wood in bushfire-prone areas. As we've seen over the past few years, there's been an increase in wildfire and certainly an increase in regulatory requirements around how we design in bushfire-prone areas. And I guess for landscape architects, correctly designing and specifying for bushfire is really fundamental. It really does mean choosing the right vegetation, plants and trees, and also the right timber products. And again, we've got two great speakers here, Boris Iskra, who's the National Standards and Codes Manager with FWPA, and sits on most of the industry's fire-related standards representative committees. So he'll talk about and explain all about bushfire attack levels, about their assessment, about the different key design considerations for timber structures and different products in those areas. Also, choosing the right plants and correct locations for those plants also helps reduce bushfire risk in gardens. And some plants do have intrinsic characteristics which reduce their ignition and the flammability ratings. And so to present on that, we've got Daniel Idzak from the Country Fire Authority, who's one of the key vegetation and plant management leaders, and he's going to talk about key plant selection criteria and the importance of maintenance. So some great webinars coming up over the next 5 weeks. And we encourage you to, if you haven't already, to register for some of those upcoming ones, please do so. But coming to today's presentation, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today for webinar 1, Dr. Fabiano Ximenes. Fabiano is a senior research scientist with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. He holds a Bachelor of Forestry, a Master's in Wood Science, and also a PhD in Carbon Dynamics in wood and paper products and landfills. Fabiano has been active for over 20 years developing and implementing novel methods to estimate carbon more accurately in forest systems and in wood products using a true life cycle assessment approach. And he's a world expert in the dynamics at end of life of decomposition of wood products and products in landfills. This work and other projects have informed the development of national and international greenhouse inventories and have been actively considered in the formulation of carbon policy. So you can see Fabiano is eminently qualified to talk to us today on this topic of forests, plantations, wood products, and Australia's carbon balance. In terms of what we hope you get out of today's presentation, in terms of learning outcomes, it's an understanding of the different forest types that supply the timber that we use in Australia, an understanding of the carbon benefits of a renewable and sustainable forest management regime, and an understanding of the true carbon cycle impact of forest and wood products when a full life cycle assessment approach is used. So without further ado, I'll stop sharing my screen here and hand over to Fabiano.
Thank you, Alastair, for the kind introduction. I will start sharing my screen now.
Okay, it's up and running now, Fabiano.
Good to go. Excellent. Thanks, Alastair. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in today. Thanks, Alastair, in particular, for the invitation to talk today, and WoodSolutions and AILA as well. It's a good opportunity. I'm talking today from Parramatta in Sydney, which is the land of the Darug people, so I pay my respects to them. And today I will be covering what I believe to be the key elements that one needs to understand around carbon implications to do with forest management and forestry. And that covers a range of different elements there, but primarily looking at carbon dynamics in forests, and then looking at what happens to wood products once they're produced, both in service and also, as Alastair mentioned, when they do reach landfills eventually. What is the role of lifecycle assessments and environmental sort of footprinting type studies, particularly around carbon footprinting as well. And I'll briefly touch, to finish it off, I'll briefly touch on some opportunities around novel bioproducts from forests, particularly as the world becomes more and more carbon constrained. just thought I would give my department a little bit of a plug to start with. So I, as Alastair mentioned, I work for New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. We do have a forest science unit within the DPI forestry branch. So DPI forestry is comprised of forest science, forest policy, and there's also plantations regulation unit. But within the forest science group, we've got 4 key areas of research. We do work around forest ecology, we do work around health and biosecurity issues, we do resource assessment type work, but also my area of expertise, which is forest carbon and biomass. So it would be a good idea to start with a generic sort of map of where Australia's forests are located. And by and large, you can tell here that they're largely on coastal areas, and by and large, there are native forests. There's a small proportion of plantations. In terms of areas, as I mentioned, there's a total of 134 million hectares of forests in Australia, and out of which 132 million, so the vast majority, is in our native forest state. We do have roughly about 2 million hectares of forests in our plantation state as well. And this fact gets a little bit lost in the general community quite often in terms of understanding about what proportion of the native forest state actually is included in the net public harvestable areas. So basically, what areas within that native forest state are actually allowed to be harvested, and it turns out to be quite a small area. Only about 5 million hectares of that 134 million is actually available for production or for management for production in terms of products. And even more interesting is that with each year, roughly about 0.07 million hectares of native forests are actually harvested. So that it's roughly about 1.4% of the areas that are allowed to be harvested. So it's quite a small proportion of the forest state. And the key point there as well is that once those forests are harvested, they are regrown so that they can produce timber for future generations as well. So that's just gives you a bit of a sense of scale in terms of production. And also important to understand, sort of taking back to basics around how carbon is actually taken up by the trees. And as Alastair mentioned, there's a process called photosynthesis, which I'm sure all of you will be familiar with. But the point there is to say that that process really only needs carbon dioxide in the air, water, and sunlight and sun power to basically enable the production of the carbon-containing molecules in the timber, primarily carbohydrates. So that's where it all starts, and it's sunlight, water, and CO2, and then you get the carbon accumulation in the trees over time. Again, a bit of setting the scene type information here. There have been, attempts at quantifying the amount of carbon that's actually stored in all of Australia's forests, and it's not an exact science, but the best estimates that we have is that currently about 10.5 billion tons of carbon are stored in our forest state, in the above ground portion of our forests. And to give you an idea of scale, that's equivalent to about close to 80 times Australia's annual net greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a huge reservoir of carbon in our forests, and that doesn't take into account any soil carbon benefits as well. And the estimates, and again, estimates vary, but the best estimates we have is that approximately 11.5 billion tons of carbon is actually stored in our soils in Australia, in forest soils in Australia. Another important fact to keep in mind is that as the trees grow old, the rate of carbon sequestration actually decreases. So the younger the tree is, the hungrier for carbon they are. So the more, the higher the rate of uptake is. As the trees grow old, that appetite sort of decreases. And to give an idea of the differences in the rate, so a young eucalypt forest, for instance, would be sequestering about 6.4 tons of carbon per hectare per year in Australia. And that figure decreases to less than 1 ton of carbon a hectare per year as the trees grow mature, as the forests become more mature. So that's something to keep in mind. The other interesting element there when you're thinking about carbon in forests is that most of the biomass in the trees and most of the carbon by default is in the woody fraction, so the stem and the branches, and actually below ground in the roots. When you think about the other elements, bark and leaves, for instance, they typically account for about 10 to 5% of the biomass in mature trees. And another little fact to keep in mind is that, if you remove all the water from a tree, you end up with typically about 50% of the remaining weight as carbon. Now, thinking about the variety of different forest types in Australia and how they differ in terms of their carbon sequestration or the carbon sequestration potential, I just thought I would share this little diagram, which was from the Cooperative Research Centre for Greenhouse Accounting, which I was part of in the early 2000s, and that's a neat illustration about the huge variability that there is in Australia in terms of carbon stocks in different vegetation types. If you go down the bottom of the graph, you look at grasslands, for instance, there are vast areas of grasslands in Australia, but their carbon sequestration capacity on a hectare basis is quite low. It's about less than 1 ton of carbon a hectare, whereas if you go up all the way to the top to some really, exceptionally dense small pockets of native forests in certain areas of Victoria and Tasmania, you do get to some areas where that carbon sequestration, the carbon storage, can get up to 900 tons of carbon a hectare, which is a huge amount. So, but in between the 0.5 and the 900, there's a range of different forest types which have different characteristics when it comes to their actual carbon sequestration potential. And how do we typically measure the carbon or the biomass? Really, there are many different ways you can go about doing it. Traditionally, you have information that you collect via inventory systems. So most forest companies have inventory schedules in place to make sure that they monitor the growth of trees over time so that they understand the final productivity of different forest types. And that information can typically be used to predict how much carbon or biomass the forest will have. But however, and some of the things that they're used to measure, obviously you need to understand what species you're talking about. You need to know, what is the height of the tree, what is the diameter of the tree, because then you can correlate those figures with actual volumes of wood. And here I'm just showing you a picture of a typical harvester in a native forest. So as I said, we measure things like height or the length of different components of the trees, and then I guess one of the things we've done over time as part of our studies around carbon cycling in forests is we've identified that the most robust way or the most accurate way of determining biomass in trees is actually weighing the biomass. So we devised this biomass weighing trailer here in the picture, which basically is able to weigh up to 5 tons of material at a time. So which really makes it possible for us to go into forest and work with harvesting contractors to understand precisely what is the biomass that's contained in a range of trees of different sizes. And that's again showing the trailer in action, weighing crown material, for instance. And when you combine those two elements of measurement of different tree elements like diameter and height with the information that we derive on the mass or the biomass in the tree, we can start deriving these relationships, which basically allow you to predict what the weight or the carbon in the biomass in the tree will be as for trees of different sizes. So if you weigh enough trees of different diameter sizes, for instance, you can have developed relationships that provide you confidence that next time you're going to the forest, instead of harvesting the tree and weighing it, you can simply measure the diameter, and you have a pretty good idea as to how much biomass, how much carbon that tree will actually contain. And obviously, a lot of that work is supported by collecting a lot of samples in the field, and that's we collect samples of the wood and the branches and leaves and bark, etc. Take it back to the lab and do a range of analysis around physical characteristics like moisture content, density, but also we prepare samples for carbon analysis so that we can really have a good understanding about how much carbon those different types of trees can actually contain. Now, I just thought at this point, I'll make a distinction between, the key production forestry elements in Australia. So that's primarily based both on a native forest state, but also based on a plantation state, right? And there are fundamental differences in the two ways of, or the two types of forests in Australia. So from a native forest management perspective, all the native forestry that's done in the public states managed on a varying harvest and regrowth cycle. So what I mean there is that when they're harvested, there's a commitment to regrow those forests so that they can keep producing timber into the future. There's a huge variability in terms of those harvest cycles. Typically in Australia, depending on the state, depending on the region within the state, depending on the species, those cycles can vary between 50 to 90 years. And also there's huge variability in terms of the types of products that are produced from those different forest types. And from a native forestry perspective, including there's a huge amount of a huge variability in terms of high value applications. Your traditional flooring products, decking products, furniture, structure applications, engineered wood products, which are becoming more and more, gaining more sections of the market, electricity transmission poles, etc. And also what are considered lower value products financially, but they're still obviously very valuable products from a functional perspective, which includes pallets for transportation needs, pulp for paper production, and a range of landscaping products. One thing that really differentiates native forestry from plantation forestry is that, if you think about native forests, they are not managed uniformly. If one species, they're managed quite often as a range of species growing together as a natural forest. Therefore, on a hectare basis, the recovery rates that you get will be necessarily lower than from a plantation forestry perspective, because you are managing the forest not just from a production perspective, but also to achieve a number of different multiple benefits. And if you think about hardwood plantations in Australia, there are two key different types. Those plantations that are managed for pulpwood production and those that are managed for sawlog production. So the pulp plantations typically have harvest cycles of around 10 to 15 years, and sawlog plantations anything between 25 and 45 years, again, depending on the species, the region, rainfall, etc. So for pine plantation, I guess in addition to native forests and hardwood plantations, we have large areas in Australia of pine plantations. Those are harvested in cycles of varying between 25 and 35 years. Typically radiata pine, so Pinus radiata is the main, by far, the majority of that resource that's grown in Australia. The high value products that come out of those plantations is quite different from what you get from a native forestry. They're primarily destined for the residential construction market, so sawn material for residential construction, primarily framing, wall framing, and roofing. And another key difference is that a lot of the residues that are produced, particularly the sawmill, they are used for the production of engineered wood products such as medium density fiberboard, MDF, or particle board. But also there's a fair chunk of that residue that's used for pulp production and landscaping as well. And as I said before, by virtue of being a much more uniform forest, where you're typically just growing the one species, by default, you're going to have higher recovery values in the forest. You're going to take more products out of the forest than what you would from a native forest system. So we've done a lot of studies over time to understand, what proportion of the biomass actually remains in different portions of the trees. And this table here gives a bit of a flavor for what those values are and how they differ for different species in Australia. So if you're looking at this table here, we've got Eucalyptus globulus, which is one of the blue gum, which is one of the key plantation species, particularly for pulp in Australia. So we've got the distribution there in terms of the biomass allocated to different biomass different fractions of the trees. Pinus radiata, as I mentioned before, the main softwood or pine plantation in Australia. And then it's things like environmental plantings. So those are quite often a mix of different native species grown together with the whole purpose of serving an ecosystem sort of environmental need. But they're not used for timber production. So they're much more variable in their composition. And then you've got mallees, which are normally they're eucalyptus types of trees. There are over 200 different species of mallees in Australia. They're not grown for typical timber production. They're grown mostly for carbon sequestration projects, but also used for eucalyptus oil production. And they are quite different to the other species in the sense that a lot of the biomass is actually contained in the root fractions. So almost 50% of the biomass in the mallees is actually below ground, so which is significantly higher than for most other species. But as I mentioned before, by and large, for the main types of species in Australia, the majority of the biomass is in the woody materials, so the stems and the branches. And then we've done a lot of studies as well at the harvest, when the trees are harvested, to understand, what proportion of the biomass goes to the log products, so the commercial logs that come out of the forest, and then what proportion stays in the forest in the form of crowns of stump. One interesting little fact there in terms of what happens to the bark is that in native forest systems, when you do harvest the trees, the logs are debarked in the forest because they come off much more easily. So that bark stays back in the forest, whereas for radiata pine and cypress pine, that bark actually is not, the bark, it stays with the logs until they get to the sawmill, and they are debarked at the sawmill. So, and that drives as well, a better an application for the bark in terms of being used for landscaping purposes as well. And I guess the other point here is that there is a big difference in the recovery rates for different native hardwoods. If you look at blackbutt, matsmate, and spotted gum as some of the key commercial species in Australia, the recoveries there range from anything between 45 to 63%. So, and that's primarily a function of basically the intrinsic biology of the tree and the architecture of the tree. So there are a lot of different factors that drive that, but also in terms of what markets there are locally as well. Okay, so we talked a lot about carbon in terms of carbon sequestration and biomass and how much carbon there is in different elements. But when we're talking about carbon balance in forests, it's just as important to understand the emission side of things. Where are the key sources of emissions from a carbon perspective in our forest systems? And as I'm sure most of you would know, bushfires are a major emitter of carbon in Australia. Just to give you an example of how important that is, in our last major bushfires in 2019, the emissions from our forests were equivalent. The emissions were about 830 million tons of carbon dioxide in that 1 year, which basically dwarfed Australia's annual emissions. It was basically twice Australia's annual emissions for 2019. So when that happens, when those massive bushfires happen, they have a huge impact on Australia's greenhouse accounts and carbon accounting. But I guess that fortunately, one of the key things to understand as well is that by and large, most of that carbon is reabsorbed by the trees once they recover from those bushfires within the next, within 10 to 15 years from the bushfires occurring. So another big element there is the decay of biomass in terms of natural decay in the forest. So, elements that stay behind, branches that fall, or harvest residues, those will decay over time. And also, if you are managing for production, then you will have emissions from the use of heavy machinery for both harvest and transportation of material. So you have to take those things into account. And that's, I guess, leads me to a picture where you can sort of combine those elements together. So in your typical national park, for instance, a conservation forest, you do have those dynamics of carbon sequestration in the trees, storage in the woody debris, and also emissions to do with decay and bushfires, as I mentioned before. In our production state, you do have the same dynamics in play. You do have carbon sequestration in the trees, obviously. You've got this bushfires that occur. You've got decay of timber. But then you have to take into account also, as I mentioned, the emissions to do with the use of machinery for harvesting and timber processing. But also you need to account for what happens to timber products in terms of carbon storage, in terms of other elements, and the potential therefore using some of those residues to sustainably produce energy as well, which I'll touch upon a bit later on. So these are the key elements. When you talk about dynamics in forest and wood products, these are the things you really need to think about. So forest carbon, as I mentioned before, but then what happens to the carbon in terms of different types of wood products, what functions they'll perform, how much, how long, what's the permanence of their carbon in service. And then if they do go to landfills, do they stay does their carbon stay in the landfill? And then what are the emission reductions if you do use timber, which is primarily, considered to be a more greenhouse friendly product than other alternatives? So what can we quantify what the benefit is? So starting with carbon neutral products and service, this is showing a picture here of some pine, radiata pine being cut in a sawmill and boards produced. Key thing to remember is that different types of wood products have different service lives, and that translates into different permanence of carbon. Majority of wood products, particularly from, if you're thinking about the pine plantations, is used for residential construction. We've done some work over time, surveys of the use of timber in houses in Australia, and some of our previous work has suggested that the typical or the mean or the average service life for wood products in houses is around 45 years. And when you think about all the timber that's currently accumulated in wood products and service in Australia, the Australian government actually tracks that in the carbon accounting system, and we are close to 100 million tons of carbon, currently being stored in all the different types of wood used in Australia. And, there are ways of quantifying what that actual benefit is. And one of the things is by using the environmental product declarations, which some of you may be familiar with. And they basically tracks the fate of that carbon from when the trees grow through to harvesting, processing, packaging, and then getting to the consumer. So I guess in a nutshell, when you consider how much carbon is actually in the product, you have, in the case here of a kiln dry and dressed hardwood, you end up with 1.22 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per cubic meter of sawn hardwood product, just purely in terms of carbon storage. But then if you deduct the fossil greenhouse gas emissions associated with producing that material, and then other emissions, biogenic emissions other than CO2, then you end up with a net figure there, which basically highlights the true carbon footprint for that 1 cubic meter of kiln dry and dressed hardwood. And similarly for kiln dry and dressed softwoods, we can derive a similar picture. Basically, we end up with 900 kilograms of CO2 equivalent in the product, in a cubic meter of the product. And then when you deduct emissions, then you end up with this net figure of 718 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per cubic meter of dressed softwood. So if you're interested in finding out more about how some of this is derived, there's a lot of information, I think, in the WoodSolutions website as well, on the EPDs for the different wood types. So another element that I really want to show here a little bit is around the potential for bioenergy, and that's really because, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of residues that are produced at different stages of production of timber, and this diagram here sort of highlights that. So if you've got the trees that are growing in the forest, once the trees are harvested, you obviously have some residues that are left behind. When those logs are processed in a sawmill, there are residues that are produced. And also at the end of life, there's a lot of potential there for use of those waste streams. So all those different residues can potentially be used for the purposes of producing bioenergy. And the difference between, and obviously what happens at the bioenergy facility is that when you produce the product or the energy, that carbon is emitted back to the atmosphere. The difference there is that this is part of a natural cycle, right? So this carbon dioxide that's produced, it's going to be taken up by another tree that's regrowing on the same spot. Whereas if you think about a coal-fired power station, that carbon dioxide is emitted, and that's it. It's a one-way street. That coal doesn't get replenished. So that is a key fundamental difference between renewable bioenergy and the production of power or energy from fossil fuels. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it recognizes that benefit. And in all the predictions about how we can reduce the impacts of global warming into the future, bioenergy plays a huge role in the scenario modeling. I just some examples here of some of the biomass that's currently used in Australia for different purposes. Got a facility here in New South Wales where they're 100% powered by biomass, and therefore they are displacing the use of fossil fuels. And that's for the sugarcane facility. And there are other things as well which are coming online, which are really interesting opportunities there to combine, for instance, biomass with solar generation, which provides huge opportunities for regional communities, because particularly in Australia, where there are so many different areas where there's really good solar opportunities. If you could combine that with biomass, that provides an opportunity there for self-sufficiency for different regional centres. But I'm not going to spend much time on this, just to highlight the opportunities there in that space. Okay, just following the life cycle of the timber, once the products reach the end of the service life, there's two main options currently in Australia: recycle, reuse, or landfill. Unfortunately, a lot of the wood waste, a lot of the wood ends up in landfills in Australia, historically in between 1.5 to 2 million tonnes a year. So if you think about, this has been happening for decades, it's quite a significant pool of products that we need to account for. So we've done a lot of work, as Alastair mentioned before, to determine what is the implication from a carbon perspective of putting those things in landfills. So we've done excavations and experimental work. We've done a total of 9 excavations in Australia to basically see, try and extract different materials and then sort of do a bunch of analysis to determine how much carbon was left behind. So just a few pictures here of some of the work we've done. Is our first ever excavation a long time ago at Lucas Heights in landfill here in Sydney. And again, not rocket science, it's really about digging a hole and then sorting through the rubbish and then separating any wood material that you can find. And some of the other excavations that we've done, with examples there of different types of products, including paper. Paper after 20 years in landfill, again, it's a very common find for us in terms of coming across a lot of paper in landfills, which most people would have expected to have disappeared quite quickly. And in fact, that's one of the ways we actually date how old the material is, how long it's been in landfills. It's literally by just checking the paper. And that's the examples of the landfill paper on the bottom, and then an equivalent edition, a fresh edition, if you like. And similarly, we've gone through a lot of trouble to find, similarly replicates of the same type of material that we found in landfill, so that we could compare the chemistry of those different products. And here's a selection of different wood products that coming from landfill. In terms of in the center there, we've got a section of ironbark, and then radiata pine products around it. You can see the profile is still largely untouched after 46 years in landfill. And things like MDF as well, less distinguishable because the glue over time is leached from the products, but you can still see the different layers of the MDF there, clearly distinguished. And also we've done a lot of work in the lab, under controlled conditions to understand how much carbon is actually left behind after you put products in landfills. And I guess the story is that, to cut a very long story short, is that only a maximum of 1.4% of the total carbon in wood products is actually lost from Australian landfills. So the vast majority of that carbon can be considered to remain in storage for the foreseeable future. And that is primarily because landfills become anaerobic very quickly. And that means that oxygen is depleted. And that changes the nature of decomposition in landfills from a fungal decomposition mode to bacterial. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with bacterial decomposition, but it's a very different mode of decomposition, and which basically is very limited in how it can actually attack the wood. So the combination of anaerobic conditions and also the presence of the lignin within the wood, those two things together are the key elements sort of making the timber quite resistant to decomposition. So all in all, what that means is that, depending on what happens to the wood product at the end of the service life, whether it's recycled, so that carbon, if it's recycled, it's a great thing because the carbon remains in the product as a physical carbon. If it goes to landfill, not a great thing from a resource use perspective, but from a greenhouse gas perspective, not a bad thing because the carbon is actually stored. And if it's used for energy and if it's displacing fossil fuels, then equally there is a greenhouse benefit there. So I think all in all is just to say, well, for the key disposal options or pathways for timber in Australia, the greenhouse outcome is likely to be good. And when you take that into account, we can estimate what that reservoir of carbon is in landfills, and the latest estimates from the Australian government, which has used a lot of the research that we've done, is that we currently have about 51.5 million tonnes of carbon stored in our landfills purely from the wood products that have been put in landfills over time. And if you combine that storage with what's in wood products and service in Australia as well, the total combined is equivalent to all of Australia's annual greenhouse gas emissions. So just quickly moving to the next element here, which is around product substitution. That's understanding, what is the implication of using timber or different types of wood products as opposed to carbon or greenhouse intensive products. And Alastair touched a little bit on that on his initial presentation. But the idea is that, the combined impact of having low energy intensity, being a renewable material, physical carbon storage versus alternatives, which they're not renewable typically, they have a high emission intensity, and they don't store carbon. So when you take those things into account and you can actually quantify the benefit, typically we can say that, for each ton of carbon, say in the framing material or in your decking or etc. So for each ton of carbon in those products, there is an equivalent emission reduction of 1 to 2 tons of carbon if you use a timber as opposed to other greenhouse intensive materials like bricks or concrete or etc. So that's just a way of quantifying that substitution benefit, the fact that you're using a more carbon-friendly material than your fossil fuel-based products. And this is another way of quantifying that benefit. And I just highlight 2 products here that are probably closer to your market. So Australian hardwood decking here. So basically this y-axis here gives you the, how much carbon is emitted by producing that bit of that type of product. So the lower it is, the lower the carbon emissions are. So basically, the lower the product is in this graph, the more beneficial it is for the environment from a climate perspective. So Australian hardwood decking is a little bit better than treated pine decking because there are emissions associated with treatment in the pine decking. But then if you compare both with the timber decking that's imported from Southeast Asia, which by and large would come from questionable forest sources, you can see the huge difference there. So there's much more carbon emitted to do associated with the timber decking from Southeast Asia. And then similarly for hardwood cladding, if you look at treated pine cladding compared to a hardboard and then fiber cement, you can see the difference there in terms of emissions associated with fiber cement compared with treated pine cladding. So it's just another way of representing the benefit. I'm just very conscious of the time, so very quickly going to go through these. So we can bring all those elements together to determine what is the carbon balance in different forest types. There's been a lot of controversy in Australia, and I'm sure you're aware of a lot of the debate around the merits or otherwise of native forestry in Australia, for instance. And it's just a few examples here of some of the studies that have been produced over time in some of the media. I guess we looked at this from a number of different angles, but also taking into account all the different life cycle elements, which you really hope I sort of demonstrated to you guys that it's important to look at all the different elements that are showed here to get a true picture of what the impact of forestry is. And when you get all those, put all those things together into the one graph, you can see here that the dark line represents your conservation forest, and then the increasing shaded areas represent the impact of production forestry. And you can see by adding up all the different elements in terms of what needs to be accounted for from a carbon balance perspective, you can see that the production state quickly outgrows the conservation state from a carbon benefit perspective. So just to show you the importance of actually looking at it from a life cycle perspective. And it's not just us saying this, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has highlighted this benefit associated with forestry in many different reports. I'll just leave you with some of their quotes here, which prove that. But also a different way of looking at is also using life cycle assessment, or LCA, which is basically a really neat way to look at the impacts, not just from a global warming perspective, but a number of different impact assessment categories of a product or production system, basically looking from the cradle to grave, ideally perspective. So it's really looking at the environmental impact across the whole life cycle of different products. And I'm just quickly going to show you the results of some work that we did just as an example of the application of that type of assessment. So, and in this case was the use of wood products in houses in Sydney. And this sort of just shows you the boundaries of what was included in the assessment. And the approach was to work with one of the key project home designers, Masterton Homes in Sydney, got hold of their bill of quantities for the 2 popular house designs. And then we varied that to achieve a maximized timber construction option and then ran an LCA model, and then determined what the greenhouse impact was. And just a quick picture here of the two different designs that we worked with, Infinity and Villainous, a single story and double story place. And very quickly, some of the results that came out of that work, and just gives you an idea of how life cycle assessment sort of outputs look like, or what they look like. And here we can see the comparison between timber and using timber and tiles in your house versus carpet and tiles. And the higher the column here, the higher the carbon intensity, and so the more emissions result from the use of that combination of products. And you can see here how using timber and tiles is virtually carbon neutral, because you've got the negative and the positive sort of basically equal to each other. So when you do that same analysis for all the different elements of the house, you can sort of reconstruct the house, if you like, and then see what the total impact is of designing the house, sort of maximizing use of timber versus your typical design, which doesn't maximize use of timber. And the output there, on a nutshell, is that if you go for the timber maximized design, on average, you've got a saving of about 30 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per house, which is significant. And that gets translated. The other option there, or the other opportunity for the industry, is to realize some of those carbon benefits in the National Emissions Reduction Fund. And just quickly just mention here that when you grow plantations in Australia, depending on the circumstances in which you are planting your trees, you may be eligible to claim carbon credits. And that includes both carbon in the trees as well as harvestable products, and you have to take into account also emissions to do with, as I said before, harvest and transport, use of fertilizer, fire, etc. So forest growers are they have access to this as an option, and there's more information here if you like. And just quickly, in the built environment, there's no example in Australia, but overseas there is a scheme that rewards the use of timber in construction. It's the Pure Earth bio-based materials methodology. And again, if you're interested in finding out more about this, you can go to their website, and there's a lot of information on this, but it basically rewards that carbon storage in different wood products in buildings. And finally, just the final thing, just to highlight that, as the use of fossil fuels in the world become much more limited, in a lot of cases, the natural replacement is a biomass-based alternative. And that will create a huge market, particularly for those residues that I mentioned before, which are inevitable from a forestry perspective. So, and that's just to highlight some of the really sort of exciting new kind of innovative uses for that biomass, including bioplastics, including replacing jet fuel with bio-based fuel, wood-based chemicals, and textiles. So there's a number of different markets that are predicted to really grow, and a lot of them will be fueled by biomass from forests. And this, I'm just going to leave you with this diagram, which basically tries to encapsulate virtually everything that I talked about in my talk, and trying to sort of demonstrate how forestry in general can contribute towards better climate outcomes. Yeah, so I'm just going to leave you with that. And with this, I'll thank you for your attention. And if you would like to contact me if any questions or any clarifications, my email is there, and also our website address is at the bottom of the slide. But thank you.
Thanks, Fabiana. That was fantastic. If you just want to unshare your screen for a sec.
Sure.
And I just remind participants online, we'd love to get some of your questions, so please just add them into the Q&A tab. We've still got time to do that, so we certainly encourage you. Yeah, look, it's such an interesting area, this carbon area. I know, speaking to a number of landscape architects, I mean, you guys have always understood the benefits of trees and storage of carbon, but really in terms of that broader sort of building environment at the moment, the last 10 years has been a sort of fixation on operational energy and operational carbon, but the last 12 months there's a huge interest now in the embodied impact of materials, and also what happens at the end of life, as you mentioned, Fabiano, this sort of interest in circular economy. So it really is a big area, and look, there's a lot of misinformation out there at the moment. So it's great, Fabiano, to have an expert like yourself who really does understand the benefits that forests do have in that sort of global picture and reducing to get into a zero carbon footprint. So thanks for that. Look, we've got some questions coming in now, and certainly, as I say to those online, please post some more. We've got a question here from an anonymous attendee, but it does come up actually quite a bit when we talk about native forests. The question was, how much biomass from wood is actually being produced from residues versus whole logs? It's just mentioning in Tasmania, historically, the idea was that residues were used for pulp, but in fact, sometimes you see whole logs being wood chipped. I don't know if you have a view on that. I've got to make a comment, Fabiano, but you might like to make a comment as well.
Yeah, no, look, I think it's understandable, but I guess you just have to look at it from a financial perspective. If a log has a value that's higher than a lower value proposition, there's no real incentive for the forest grower to actually use that for the lower value proposition. So purely from a financial perspective, it doesn't make sense to do that. But I think the problem is that, as I said, native forest systems, they are by and large very varied systems. So they have, a lot of trees that are not necessarily, they may be poorer in form, etc. So there will be a higher volume of residues produced. There is no question about it. So to me, the question there is about, how can we maximize the higher value product from the forest, but also how can we maximize the use of that lower value residue for a number of different applications. And that's where I think things like that, the new types of bioproducts and chemicals and things that are coming, I think they're really going to sort of provide a real incentive for a lot of that resource to be used in a more, I guess, valuable way, if you like. But obviously keep in mind that you need to retain a proportion of those residues for different ecosystem services as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Fabiano. And that's important. I think with a native forest, people understand there's a whole range of different quality trees that are out there. They're not all saw logs. And again, sort of recognising, as you said at the start, it's only a very small percentage of native forests that are actually, in terms of the overall volume that's harvested in any one year and all regrown. I mean, that the idea being that saw logs are a higher economic benefit, as you said, but some of those lower sort of or poorer quality residual trees still have a value, and certainly paper is something we still continue to use. So it's a high value product when you look at it in that sense. So using that product is still important, and then regenerating the forest afterwards is a key thing. So having, particularly for some species, they need those open areas to regenerate. So we can't just sometimes leave those trees behind, even though trees are left for habitat protection and whatever. But yeah, the economic side of it, I think, is the clear one, Fabiana. I mean, sometimes sort of logs might be going to wood chipping, but you wouldn't be doing that normally because it just makes no economic sense. Question here from Ron. In the areas of natural forest, is the area of natural forest decreased? Is the urban expansion impact on the area of natural forest a bit of an issue? Do you have a view there?
From a production perspective, I presume? No, I think the issue probably more is the increased trend towards obviously converting state forests into national parks, right? So that has had a huge impact on the availability of timber from native forest systems. So I think that by far the most, the highest impact in terms of production.
Mm-hmm. Actually, this is a great question from Martin. I love questions from different professional groups. This is a good one from a landscape architect. Fabiano, great presentation. Lots of information there. My question relates to the age of trees and the comment about trees absorbing more at a younger age. When you look at the weighted graph, the largest sequestration was the biggest trees. Given sequestration is based effectively on tree canopy to be able to sequester in CO2 through the leaf stomata, I would have thought that the maximum sequestration would occur when the tree reaches maximum canopy size. Also, you had a lot of references in your presentation. Can we get a list of those papers? Yeah. What's your thoughts on that? It was an interesting question.
Yeah, no, look, because as trees age, as you can appreciate, they a lot of the cells start dying as well. So you've got, as they grow, they've got active. The sapwood is primarily 100% of the tree, but as they start growing old, a lot of the material becomes hardwood, which is dead cells. So there's less of a need for the tree. Once it reaches a certain height, there's less of a need for it to devote any energy towards growing any bigger. And so, that naturally that rate of sequestration will decrease. But you're right that they do store a lot of carbon, but from a sequestration perspective, it's actually a zero-sum game at that point because the level of sequestration reduces dramatically And that's offset by the loss of limbs and things and mortality that, it starts sort of occurring. So you start losing carbon from those emissions, so and it reaches a steady state, really, when it gets to that sort of mature level. So you're right, it's hugely important as a carbon store, but not so much as a carbon sequestration.
I like that analogy. Sometimes trees are like humans. Like when we're young, we eat a lot more. When we're growing, and as we get older, we stay the same size, but we don't eat quite so much. Look, we're just on 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock now, so we probably need to finish up. So thank you, Fabiano, on behalf of all of us for a fantastic presentation. I just would remind everyone that these webinars are recorded, so it'll be posted up on the WoodSolutions website, so you can go back and have a look at it afterwards, or let your colleagues know if they're of interest. Also, just a reminder that this is the first of 5 in the series. So if you haven't registered for some of the later ones, please do so. And we look forward to taking you through those each week. Next week, as I mentioned, we're really excited that we've got 2 of your own AILA members talking about some of their innovative use of timber with some case studies. So please join us on the 5th of April for that webinar. So thank you all today for joining us. We hope you found value out of that, and we look forward for seeing you over the next 4 weeks for the rest of the webinar series. Have a great day. Bye.